before. We read about the spies who complained about Eretz Yisrael and the Gezerah and the Dor HaMidbar, that they would all die over the course of 40 years. Just an interesting little point. At the very end of last week's Parsha, we talk about tzitzis, the mitzvah of tzitzis. And tzitzis is kind of in between the story of Korach and the story of the Meraglim. And there actually is an interesting question how tzitzis relates to both sides of the story. If you remember, well, I didn't speak last week, but I spoke last Friday night. I don't know if you heard it, but when we were talking about the Meraglim, the basic idea of the Meraglim was a lack of self-esteem, a lack of a belief that they were worthy of conquering the land of Israel if Moshe Rabbeinu was not going to be with them. Because remember, it was already known that although Moshe did not commit the sin which would keep him out of the land of Israel, it was already known that he would not be entering the land of Israel. Because Eldad and Medad were the two elders who were prophesying. And what was their prophecy? Their prophecy was, Moshe will die and Yeshua will go in. Now remember the basic idea. I'm going to go back a little bit. In the Midbar, the Jewish people are living a supernatural existence within a spiritual cocoon. They have the man that comes down from heaven. They have clouds of glory that surround them. They have traveling water. They have Moshe Rabbeinu. When they go to Eretz Yisrael, they're going to lose all of that. There's not going to be man. They're going to have to plant their crops. There's not going to be traveling water. They will depend on the rain, which in Eretz Yisrael comes and goes. There's not going to be clouds of glory. They're going to have to fight wars. They're going to have to dig ditches and build buildings and create economies and have armies. The divine presence is going to be very, very concealed, very hidden. Now, when you live in a world where it's God's presence is concealed, there are two possible things that can happen. And both of them are negative. One is you become despondent, you become depressed, you become hopeless. You say, God is not with me. There is no God in my life. This is called Yiyush. Yiyush is you give up. You basically say, I'm tzebrachen, I'm broken. There is an opposite reaction in which you become arrogant as you succeed in life and you don't see the direct relationship to Hashem. The Torah itself warns us, V'ram levavecha, your heart will be high and mighty as you succeed in your conquest. V'shachachta es Hashem Elokecha, you will forget God. And you will say, very famous phrase, Kochi v'yitzim yadi, my strength and my power gave me all that I accomplished. Two opposite reactions coming from the same phenomenon of what we'll call Hester Panim, concealment of the divine. So the chait of the Meraglim, I'll bring it over to Korach in a minute, was we need to be in the Midbar longer. We need to internalize the idea of seeing God in every step of our lives so that we will know that we get into that different environment without a Moshe Rabbeinu. We will still understand that God is operating behind the scenes. The analogy I keep on thinking about is, let's say somebody's in Kollel, and they're learning really, really, really well, and they're growing. But the family is large, and it's time for them to go to work. But they're afraid of that environment. They're afraid to leave yeshiva. They're afraid. And they say, I need more time. Maybe another year. Lahavdil, I remember many, many years ago, some of you might have seen this comic, Doonesbury. It was very famous in the time, 70s, 80s. Early 90s. It was a very well-known strip. But one of the characters in Doonesbury was a guy who just could not get out of going to school. He wanted to go to every single graduate program that the universities offered. So there's law school and medical school and PhDs in biology and physics and chemistry and humanities and history and music. He kept on looking for another doctorate program to complete. And finally, he reached the end of the line. There was literally no other degree he could get. Of course, now we have postdocs. You can actually continue in that kind of situation. And he was panicked because he had to leave that sheltered world. Well, one understands when you live in a certain sheltered world, a world of holiness, a world of Kedusha, you might not feel prepared to enter a world where the Kedusha is not going to be in the same obvious way. So the Meraglim, it was said, according to some commentaries, deliberately wanted to sabotage going into the land of Israel because, number one, we get to have Moshe for more years, whatever number of years they didn't know it would be 40 years, but that was the kavanah. And we get to experience the desert, and that will prepare us. So their whole kavanah was l'shem shamayim, a very noble kavanah. I need to be in Kolel longer. I'm not ready to face a world where Hashem's presence is not so open, not so obvious, not so visible. And I need Moshe Rabbeinu around a lot longer as well. So the interesting irony is that in many ways, the punishment that God gave them was exactly what they wanted. Moshe Rabbeinu lived another 38 and a half years because of this chait, and they had the man and the be'er and all of those things. So this is such a noble intention that you immediately have the question, so what's the sin? There's always going to be a problem. Whenever you try to explain a sin, you run into a problem. So what's the sin? The sin is you don't second guess God. If God gives you a mission, then God will give you the wherewithal and the ability to accomplish that mission. Rav Tzadok writes, just as a person must have faith in Hashem, a person must have faith in themselves. Because if you don't have faith in yourself, you're disparaging HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because God put you in the world for a purpose. And to say, He put me in the world for a purpose and I don't have the ability to accomplish that purpose, you're not just saying something bad about you, you're saying Lashon Hara about Hashem. And therefore the sin of the Meraglim, I mean, I hate to put it in the more modern terms, was quite literally a lack of self-esteem, a lack of, and Klal Yisrael as well, crying, a lack of belief that we are capable of accomplishing what Hashem wants us to accomplish. When God gives a mission, God gives the tools to accomplish that mission. Now, when we look at Korach, we kind of see the opposite problem. Korach did not suffer from a lack of self-esteem. Korach considered himself equal to Moshe and Aaron. We'll talk about why that was so. So if the Meraglim represent the idea of failing to see the potential that is within you, Korach's failure was over-exaggerating his greatness and not balancing it with humility and realism. Now, in some ways, tzitzis bring out both of those ideas. There's a message to the people who make the Meraglim mistake, and there's a message to the people who make the Korach mistake. Tzitzis, ideally, has white strings and blue strings, which are called Techeilis. Right, the Torah says that on your tzitzis there should be a psil Techeilit. Now, Techeilit is a bluish color, but it can't just come from a magic marker. It has to come from a specific source. Now, as you know, in the time of the Gemara, and certainly earlier than that, they had the Techeilits. But at some point, for many, many centuries, a number of centuries, we lost the Techeilit, meaning we no longer knew exactly what the source was. It's called Chilazon, but what is the Chilazon? And as you know, there is a controversy in recent decades whether the Techeilis has been identified. Those who wear Techeilit, by and large, rely on the shellfish. It's non-kosher, but Chazal say Chilazon was a non-kosher fish. That itself is interesting. They rely on the Murex trunculus, which is a type of sea snail that they crack the shell and they extract from a gland secretions that become Techeilis. And as you know, it's a live controversy. There are those that say, since we have discovered the Techeilis, we are obligated to use it. Others say that since there is no tradition, we cannot be sure if it is Techeilis or not. Again, I don't want to talk about give a whole share on this. I mean, there's a real question. And it's a question I have myself. I try to be honest. I do not wear Techeilis because my Rebbes, my teachers, did not wear Techeilis. But I don't really know why I don't wear Techeilis, because here is the problem. Again, I'll just throw out the problem. I'm not going to address it at length. If I use the blue of the Murex trunculus, it's either real Techeilis or it's not real Techeilis. Now, if it's real Techeilis, I'm fulfilling a mitzvah of the Torah. But if it's not real Techeilis, there seems to be no downside, because that just means my tzitzis are colored blue. Blue tzitzis are kosher. So you're not Makayim Techeilis, but you're not doing an Aveira. So it seems to me logical that even if the identification of the Murex as Techeilis is not 100%, let's say it's 90%, let's say it's 80%, let's say it's 50%, let's say it's 10%. Why shouldn't a person do something that has a 10% chance of being the fulfillment of a mitzvah if there is no disadvantage? See, if there would be a disadvantage, then you'd have to weigh the percentages. If, for example, using false Techeilis invalidates your tzitzis, so then I would have to say, if I don't know for sure, I better not do anything new. If that would be the case. But that is not the case. And if it's not the case, it's hard to understand what the reason not to do it is. Okay, but be it as may, I don't want to talk about that issue. You consult your Rebbes and your rabbis and whoever it might be. If it happens to be me, it can be me, but it doesn't have to be me. But I do live in a state of cognitive dissonance on this particular issue, because again, I don't wear Techeilis. But why? I don't know. My behavior does not make sense to me. But all I can tell you is, I see people who are much, 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 much greater than I, Gedolei Hador Mamish, who also don't wear Techeilis. So the fact that I have a kasha on somebody's behavior doesn't mean that they're wrong. They're very, very great. We have to assume there's a cheshbon, but I have honestly not seen a good cheshbon for this. Okay, but be this as it may, I'm not talking about contemporary issues, but let's go back to the Torah. There was the white strings, and there was the blue strings. Rashi brings a beautiful medrash, really from the Gemara. What does the blue represent? So when you look at the blue of the tzitzis, it resembles the sea. And the sea resembles the sky. And the sky is the color of the sapphire throne of Hashem. And therefore, when I look at the Techeilis, I ultimately think of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's majesty. And that is what the blue is supposed to trigger within me. The feeling of awe and reverence that connects me to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. By the way, as a little aside, why does the Medrash use so many steps? The Techeilis reminds me of the sea, and the sea reminds me of the sky, and the sky reminds me of the Kisei HaKavod. Why don't you just cut to the chase? I look at the tzitzis and I think of the Kisei HaKavod. Why do you have to go through the sea and go to the sky? Kisei HaKavod, direct, right? Why do you have to have these intermediate stops in the journey? And the short answer is there's a lesson here too. And the lesson here is that growth in Avodas Hashem has to be a gradual, incremental process. Don't think, I put on my tzitzis, I'm connected to the Kisei HaKavod. I have to go through stages in growth. A person who is the grandson of a great gadol once asked, and he used to have a chavrusa with his grandfather. He once asked his grandfather, how do you become a great person. Adam Gadol. How do you become an Adam Gadol? So his grandfather said, first you become a small person, and then you become a great person. I mean, you want to become a great person? Become a person. First of all, become a person. That's not so easy. Not so easy to be a person, right? We want to be a great person. Let's talk about being a person. Midos, derech eretz, menschlichkeit, small things, right? But we don't want that. We always want to go to the highest levels right away. Yep. Rabbi Saul Salanter used to say, everybody, I think I've said this a few times already, but everybody would love to know Shas. I would love to know the whole Talmud. And in truth, and listen to this, in truth, that is absolutely an attainable goal. Every single person in this room can, at some point in their life, know the whole Talmud. So that's attainable. But the problem is, we want to know it in one night. I want to know Shas in one night. Most of us cannot do that. The Vilna Gaon could do it. The Vilna Gaon could learn the whole Talmud in one night. But then he says, we're not even happy with that. We want to know Shas in one night and sleep 8 hours the same night. He says that he thinks even the Vilna Gaon might not be able. The Vilna Gaon only slept 2 hours, but if the Vilna Gaon were to sleep 8 hours, even the Vilna Gaon couldn't do Shas, with an 8-hour sleep. But we're impatient. We want the results, right? We want to be strong and healthy without exercise, right? We want to lose weight and eat whatever we want. We want to wake up knowing Shas and Poskim and Zohar and Kabbalah without going through the work that it takes. So in a sense, the whole remez, don't think you look at your tzitzis, you're connected to the divine throne. You got to go through processes. You got to go through the sea, the sky. You got to be a small person before you become a great person. Because after all, greatness in many ways is simply the accumulation of a lot of small things. And if you think about it, what makes a person great? It's not necessarily that they save the world, but they live day by day by day with acts of kindness, acts of goodness, small things that on their own may not even look at as so important. And they're learning. They learn line by line by line, right? I mean, this is something that's the HR that all of us have, like we sit down and we start learning and say, I want to know the whole thing. Yeah, but you got to start with this line and this word. And then things build. Okay. But be it as it may, Techeilis overall connects us to God. It is the blue of the divine throne. Now, tzitzis, however, have to have white as well as blue. What is the idea? If blue is suggestive of connection to God, white, which is vacant, so to speak, the color is not there, represents how much of a distance we have not yet achieved. Blue reminds me of my connection to God. White reminds me of I'm not there yet. Like the old T-shirt saying, life is a journey and not a destination. Not there yet. Not yet. And you need both ideas. If all you have is the white, which many say that's what we're stuck with today, so you're aware of your failures, you're aware of your inadequacies, you're aware of your distance from God, but you're not aware of your potential. If all you have is blue, you're filled with your wondrous potential, but you don't have humility. You don't have modesty. So tzitzis is a combination of the notion of humility represented in the white. By the way, they say the flag of the state of Israel, blue and white, is taken from the tzitzis. I'm not sure why they adopted the tzitzis as a symbol, and it was not a religious symbol, the flag, but nevertheless they say it actually is based on the blue and white of the tzitzis. But be it as it may, blue reminds me of my greatness and my potential, and white reminds me of my humility, my subservience, the fact that I'm not there yet. So, the Meraglim lacked the Hakara of Techeilis, And Korach lacked the Hakara of Lavan. Which is why, you will recall, Rashi brings this, again from the Medrash, that when Korach was taunting Moshe, when Korach was making fun of Moshe, so he said, what if you have a talis that's totally Techeilis? Do you have to have tzitzis on it? And Moshe said, yeah. So Korach made an argument which actually on its face is almost nonsensical. He says, well, if one string of Techeilis is enough to do the mitzvah, then a whole talis of Techeilis should even be better. Now, the Kal V'chomer is actually a non sequitur because first of all, one string of Techeilis is not enough to do a mitzvah. You need the white strings too. And if the beged is Techeilis, you have no string. So why is that going to come? Okay, so without getting into the mechanics of Korach's argument, but you do see that Korach seems to be saying, as long as you have Techeilis, that's all you need. In other words, he's ignoring the Lavan. Korach has the gaiva without the humility. Now, here I want to share with you a very, very fascinating gematria from the Arizal that's a little enigmatic, but it's explained by the Hasidic Sefer, the Shem Mishmuel. The gematria of Moshe, we'll work with numbers, is 345. Right? Mem is 40, and Shin is 300, and Hey, 345. The gematria of Korach is 308. The difference between 345 and 308 is 37. 37 is the gematria of Hevel. Hevel. So, if you have these three gematrias in mind, 345, 308, and 37, we could express an arithmetical relationship in the following way. Moshe minus Hevel equals Korach, or Korach plus Hevel equals Moshe. Right, you get the arithmetic there. This is what the Arizal says. He does not explain the significance of any of this. What's Hevel and what's Korach and what's Moshe? What do these numbers represent? So let me share with you the Hezber that is given by the Shem Mishmuel, one of the great Hasidic masters. And he says the following. Let's go back to the very beginning of creation, or the very beginning of Adam and Chava, when Adam and Chava have children, right, the day they were created. They have children who are born fully grown, Cain and Hevel. So Chava, they were twins. Chava calls Cain because she says, Konisi ish es Hashem. Now, in Rabbinic Hebrew, the word konisi is kinyan. I acquired a man with God. And that's how some translations do it. But the truth of the matter is, in biblical Hebrew, kana often, not always, does not mean to acquire, but it means to create. Hashem is called the Konei Shemayim Va'aretz. That does not mean the one who acquires heaven and earth, but it means the one who creates heaven and earth. So what Chava is saying is, Konisi is Hashem. I have created a human being together with God. What is Chava saying? Because all Adam did was he deposited his seed, but it was the processes within Chava's body that made it a human being. I am a partner with God. Now Hevel actually means breath. It means air. It means vapor. You remember the very dark, somewhat pessimistic, very pessimistic book we read on Sukkot. It's one of the 5 Megillos. This is Koheles. And Koheles is Shlomo HaMelech's reflection on the futility of life unless you connect it to serving God. He talks about wealth, and the wealth leaves you. And there's so much injustice, so much suffering in the world. and you get bored. Life repeats itself over and over and over again. And it's a very sad book because it talks about the idea that this doesn't matter and that doesn't matter. And you leave your wealth to people who don't even care about you. That can include, God forbid, your own children. You know, I'm leaving my wealth to someone who doesn't care, you know. And at some point, because he's going through a thought process, this is very important. People don't realize this. There are actually psukim in Koheles that if you simply plucked them out of context would actually sound heretical. Like he says, who knows if the soul goes to a different place than an animal? But you have to understand the nature of Koheles, that, you know, Koheles is not a book that you read, I isolate a pasuk and talk about it. Rather, it's going through the process of a person who is reflecting on life and goes through different thoughts, and sometimes the thoughts might even be improper. But they get straightened out at the end. And there's a reason why Tanakh is written that way. Maybe what I'm saying is a little unorthodox in that sense. Because Tanakh is not only written to give me final emes, but to also address the fact that human beings are often tortured by different reflections. So it wants to present you the notion of being tortured, being confused, being faced with ambiguities, so that you know that when I have these types of problems, I can look at this book because it's grappling with it. That is why sometimes in the course of the book of Job, book of Kohelet, there will occasionally be ideas if taken in isolation are actually connected the religion. But the author wants to convey the confusion of a process so that when you're going through that confusion, you can connect to it. Okay, I hope this makes sense a little bit. Again, as I say, this may be a little unusual approach, but I actually think it's very, very emes, the way a number of Kisvei HaKodesh are written. Yeah.
Is this just relating to Nach or the whole Torah?
No, the Torah itself tends not to be written that way because those are Hashem's direct words. But in Kesuvim, you'll often have reflections like that. Okay, so Koheles begins with the refrain, Havel Havalim, Amar Koheles. Havel Havalim Hakol Havel. Now, the very famous English translation in the King James Bible is vanity of vanities, says the preacher, that's Shlomo HaMelech. Vanity of vanities, everything's vanity. So here I have to give you a little bit of an English lesson. And that is, the meaning of the word vanity in the 17th century is not the same as the word vanity today. So it's confusing to a reader. Because today, when you say vanity, you're talking about pride, arrogance. Shlomo HaMelech doesn't mean everything is arrogant and prideful. Rather, vanity in those days meant worthless, ephemeral. Now, we still use that. Taking Hashem's name in vain. That doesn't mean taking Hashem's name pridefully. It means taking Hashem's name for no purpose. So that is a use of the original term of vanity. So a better translation in contemporary English, instead of vanity of vanities, is futility of futility. That is actually what's being picked up. Life is futile. It's evanescent. It is like breath. You breathe out something, it just dissipates. It disappears. So Shlomo HaMelech's whole motif in the book of Koheles is everything disappears. Nothing lasts except fear of Hashem and doing his mitzvahs. Everything else goes away. So now, let's go back to Cain and Hevel. So why would Chava call Hevel isn't so great? Hevel, evanescent, vanishing, ephemeral, temporary, transient. That's the name you give your kid? Hevel? You're nothing? Now, you might answer, maybe she had some prophecy that he would be killed. Indeed, he was Hevel. His life was taken right after he was born. But the Shem Shmuel suggests that the name Cain and the name Hevel represent two aspects of the human personality that the world needs, and the world needs both. The world needs actually Cain and Hevel. Cain, which means creation or acquisition, refers to the impulse in man, which we might connect to the ego, but that's what creates, what initiates. Because man is in the image of God, and that means we have to create in the world. We're supposed to drain the swamps, try to cure cancer, fight disease, eradicate poverty. We don't simply say, God will take care of it. Yeah, everything depends on God, but God requires we do our part. So Cain is the one who builds cities, creates societies. And even in Torah learning, the one that builds yeshivas, who creates chidushei Torah in all aspects of life. The kayach of chidush, innovation, creation, initiative, that comes from the ego, as strange as it is. Because without that ego, I simply say, who am I to start a yeshiva? Me? Who am I to do medical research? Whatever the issue is. So Cain is a very, very positive force. It is the force of creativity and initiative. Hevel is the humility and submission to God. I am nothing. If all you have is a Cain in the world, you have arrogance without limit. If all you have is the Hevel in the world, you have paralysis, indecision, inability to move, passivity. So here's the thing. So Cain had a mission, and Hevel had a mission. But Cain's arrogance and jealousy resulted in his killing off Hevel. So you know the Mekubalim are very into the idea of reincarnation. Again, reincarnation is not a fundamental principle of Judaism. The Rambam does not count it as one of the 13 principles. Rav Saadia Gaon actually did not agree with it. But the Arizal and the Talmidim of the Arizal were very, very strong into the notion of reincarnation, the second and third chance. So Cain needed to be reincarnated so he could rectify his soul with an infusion of humility. And Hevel needed to be reincarnated so he could infuse his soul with initiative and responsibility. Korach was a reincarnation of Cain. Moshe, who is described as the most humble of all people, was a reincarnation of Hevel. Moshe rectified Hevel, because on one hand, Moshe, whose shirish is Hevel, was humble, modest, but he still took on leadership. He assumed responsibility. Moshe didn't say, oh, who am I to lead this nation? I mean, actually, initially he did, but at least, that's part of why he was reluctant. But once he took on the job, and he did it. That's the tikkun of Hevel. Yes, you're humble, you're modest, you know without Hashem you're nothing. But you do what you can do. Korach, tragically, never incorporated the Hevel in his personality, and therefore there was no rectification. And it's so interesting that this is a reversal of the story, because in the original story it was Cain who killed Hevel. In the reenactment, it is Hevel, Moshe Rabbeinu, who causes Cain's death by the ground opening up. So now, the Shem Shmuel says, we can understand the insight in the Arizal's Gematria. Korach and Moshe have the same intrinsic greatness. Korach was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. He understood the secret of Para Aduma. He was one of the Levim who carried the Aron. He was the ancestor of Shmuel Hanavi, which he saw with Ruach HaKodesh, who is equal to Moshe and Aaron, and therefore the seeds of Shmuel's greatness are in Korach. Korach and Moshe are exactly the same. The difference is, Moshe had the Hevel quality. And Korach didn't have the Hevel quality. Moshe minus Hevel equals Korach. Korach plus Hevel, you got yourself a Moshe Rabbeinu. So this is quite amazing because really, if I could mix my metaphors here, this makes Korach what we call a subject of a Greek tragedy. What do you mean by Greek tragedy? It comes from Aristotle. You know, if a person is walking and a building collapses on them, that's very, very sad. But Aristotle said that's not tragic. Tragedy is not when you're destroyed from something outside of yourself. Tragedy is when there's something within you that destroys you. Right? That's the tragedy. When someone is great, someone has so much potential, but there's something in them that destroys them. Korach is exactly that. Korach was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, but the kavod, the gaiva, the arrogance destroyed him. And this is a very, very frightening musar. How kavod can take everything away from you. Everything away. The Alter of Slobodki used to say, when a person is focused on kavod, there's no Yom Kippur, there's no anything, because it's always on your mind. You expected to get Mafter Yonah, which is an honor on Yom Kippur. You didn't get Mafter Yonah. They tell a story. It's a funny story, but it makes a point about a man who was a very devout person. He was crying on Yom Kippur, and he was even saying, Hashem, I'm nothing, I'm worthless, I don't deserve to live, I'm mud, please, 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 I beg you for forgiveness. Crying, sobbing. But then somebody else got Mafter Yonah. And the person started screaming on Yom Kippur. He says, how can you give it to him? I mean, I'm a much bigger tzaddik. So the Rav went over to him afterwards and said, I understand you're hurt, okay, maybe they did wrong, but I just heard you 5 minutes ago saying, you're nothing, you're dirt, and now you're upset because you didn't get this cover. So the guy said, well, when I'm talking to God, I'm dirt, okay. But compared to him, I'm a lot better than him. This is what kavod is. Kavod can destroy you. Now, it's so interesting that when Korach made his argument, Korach didn't say, I want to be leader. He actually didn't say that. Korach never stated an explicit claim for leadership. In fact, Korach's official claim was anarchism, or anarchy. We don't need leaders. Everybody is holy. Everybody's equal. You can call that an anarchist, or you can call that an egalitarian. And it's interesting that Moshe saw through it, because Moshe said, don't you have enough kavod? That's not answering Korach's time. Korach didn't say, I don't have enough kavod. Korach said, we're all equal. Moshe understood. Maybe you're making the equality argument, but really you're making the kavod argument. And the truth is, that's how revolutions turn out. Some of you might have read George Orwell's parody of the Russian Revolution, Animal Farm, where the animals overthrow the unjust humans, and some of the animals become dictators. Orwell's point was that's exactly what happened. You overthrow the big bad czar to make life better for people. So what you get is Lenin and Stalin. I don't think that's much of an improvement. The French Revolution, Robespierre, Pol Pot, the kind little school teacher in Cambodia who wound up killing 20 million people after he overthrew the evil king Sihanouk, whatever it is. In other words, people say, I'm doing it for the cause, but it's really about them. The other person who saw it is the unsung hero of Korach, and that's Mrs. On Ben Peles. Now, On Ben Peles is listed as one of the revolutionaries who joined Korach, only mentioned once in the Torah. No, Dasan, Aviram, Korach. An own Ben Pelas of the tribe of Reuven. He must have been somewhat famous. I mean, people would read the Torah. In those days, they would know who he was. We don't know who he is. And when it talks about the people who died, Korach, Dasan, Aviram, the 250 Nesiim, it doesn't mention on Ben Pelas. He drops out of the scene. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin, his wife saved him. You know, he hears Korach's speech, everybody's equal, every man a king. And he comes home all excited. Hey, a new day here. You know, no, we don't need bosses, we don't need Gedolim, we don't need Moshe Rabbeinu. All of us heard the first 2 commandments, the 10 commandments at Mount Sinai. So his wife gave him a reality check. His wife said, like good wives do, you're an idiot. He says, what do you think you're going to get out of this? If Moshe wins, you're a nobody. And if Korach wins, you're a nobody. You think if Korach wins, you'll be equal with everybody else? All that's going to happen is, instead of one leader, see, it's interesting. She didn't give him a musar shmuz. She didn't say, you know, a religious, oh, how can you rebel against Moshe? You know, he is the one that God chose. That would be the frum way of saying it. But she knew he wouldn't respond to that. She's very pragmatic and very practical. So, I'm not going to talk about religion with you. I'm just saying common sense. You'll get nothing. You're going to be a loser no matter which way this game comes out. So she's not even saying Moshe's going to win. She's saying either way. Moshe wins, Korach wins, you don't win. And basically, it was the strong common sense of a woman who understood that there are many hidden agendas in life. And, you know, you cannot accept claims on their surface. But be as it may, going back to the Arizal, this gematria is a remarkable gematria because, you know, if Korach would have stamazai been, we call it an eisvar, if just would have been a bum, okay, yeah, whatever. We have proud people who create trouble and get rid of him. But no, he was genuinely great. He had the potential to be holy. But the kavod and the jealousy destroyed him. And that is truly, truly a tragedy. And B'ez Hashem, we have to be aware of these factors in our own lives, that it shouldn't drag us down and take us away from what we're able to accomplish. Okay, so have a good day.
Go